Welcome to Unit 12 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we'll focus on learner factors related to second language acquisition. Specifically, we'll talk about how age, background, anxiety, motivation, and self-regulation all impact a learner's ability to acquire a language. Let's talk about age first. This tends to be the most popular topic that people love to focus on when they talk about the abilities to learn a language, and how the myth is that children can just pick up languages very quickly and easily, and adults really struggle with that. Before we get into sort of debunking that myth, let's just do a reminder about the difference between learning a first language versus learning a second language. That generally, first language learning that happens with children tends to be more naturalistic. There's a longer silent period, whereas second language learning happens with older children, adults. It tends to be more classroom focused. It requires a lot more conscious thought. When we talk about children learning a language, we often talk about something called the critical period hypothesis. And the critical period hypothesis states that there is a certain age at which when someone learns a language, they will always sound like a second language user of that language. And generally this age, it's not always clear where it is. Some people think it's just before puberty. Other people think it's much younger. It's in the toddler or preschool stage. But if you learn a language after that stage, you're much more likely to sound like a second language learner of that language, and you won't sound like a native speaker. And there is a neurological or biological reason for this, and it has to do with the brain, particularly when it comes to pronunciation. That all of us are born with a brain that can distinguish and understand all possible human language sounds. But as a child, as we grow up and we are only exposed to the sounds that are within our own language system, our brain does not bother to distinguish between the sounds that are not in our language system. And so as we grow older and then try to learn a language where there are distinctions that we didn't grow up with, it can be very hard for us to do that. Our brain has changed biologically, physically, to no longer have those kinds of connections. So there are some advantages that children have, particularly when it comes to learning the sound system of a language. So as we've said, the advantages that children have is more native-like pronunciation. They're generally also more fluent in grammar. And the other reason is that there's a lot of social pressure for children. This is a good thing, schools, families, peer environment. There's lots of pressure for them to stay motivated, learn that language. Also, children tend to have a more flexible self-identity when it comes towards a language. They're more likely to be able to view themselves as a user of that language. And so then that encourages them to lower the affective filter and participate more in that language community. Some of the disadvantages that children have is that they have a shorter attention span. And so if learning gets difficult or boring, they'll just stop. They also have more difficulty with abstract thought. So it can be hard to think of language as an object and how we can manipulate and move it. Instead, they've just been using language to communicate, and so they don't have as strong a sense of how different words fit into different grammatical categories. Adults, on the other hand, have different advantages. So one is they have a more cognitive advantage. They're more advanced learners. Their brain is more advanced. They understand what language is, and they can use their experience from their first language to help in the second language. They're also generally better at metacognitive skills and prioritizing their learning. Adults tend to be more self-directed, and they can focus on things better than children. But some of the disadvantages adults have is that they tend to be busier. They have more responsibilities. And so focusing their attention on language learning can be difficult. And because they're not constrained by school or government as much as children are to learn a particular language, they have more freedom to just say, well, I don't have time for this, and possibly abandon language learning. So when it comes to age, children versus adults, there isn't a clear winner here who's better at language learning. They're just better at different aspects of language learning. Both children and adults can be successful language learners. The reality is adults probably can do it faster than children, but they may not be as native-like in their learning of the language. Here's another factor. Talk about background, and this can encompass a variety of different sub-factors, but one of them is culture. The culture you come from may help you with language learning, but also could hinder you depending on which language you're learning. If there's lots of similarities in the culture, then you can transfer a lot of that in, and it can help you with the new language. Sometimes you may have a culture that is resistant to your learning a particular target language, maybe because of political history between those two language cultures. Also, which first language you speak can influence whether you will easily and quickly learn another language or whether it will be more difficult. For example, English speakers learning European languages that are more closely related to English will generally learn those languages faster than a Japanese or a Chinese speaker learning English will. So this is called language distance, and some language families are more closely related than others. And so learning a language that is more closely connected with your first language family will give you some advantages over learning other languages. Your educational background can make a difference. Are you used to classroom learning? Are you comfortable with a classroom environment that has a lot of interaction? In a previous video, we talked about input, output, and interaction. If you're not comfortable with those kinds of language learning experiences because of your educational background, then you may struggle to learn the language as quickly as someone else who is much more comfortable interacting with peers and using language beyond the classroom. Another background feature could be aptitude. Some people seem to have a more natural inclination to learn languages. We call this aptitude, language aptitude. And maybe their brain is just better at recognizing patterns. Maybe they just have a stronger interest in using language. But that can affect whether or not they learn language more easily than other people. Anxiety is a big factor that helps some learners learn language better than others. When we talk about anxiety, we often relate it to the affective filter. We've talked about this in multiple videos. But the affective filter is a barrier that can be lowered or can come up between a learner and the language experience, and can affect their willingness to experiment with the language and try things out, or their fear of failure. And some people have what's called trait anxiety. They're just anxious in a lot of situations. Other people have more situational anxiety, and so they could have a bad experience, which then could impact them and maybe create a bad experience with that language and not wanting to learn the language in the future. So there's a lot that teachers can do to help address anxiety in the classroom. We've talked about this in multiple videos about how teachers can play a role in creating a more comfortable learning environment, and being careful with feedback so that learners feel encouraged, that they have good experiences so that they're more willing to experiment and try out new things in the future. But a learner's ability to deal with anxiety will influence their ability to be a successful second language learner. And anxiety isn't necessarily bad. Some tension is good for language learning. It just can't be so much that it's debilitating. Okay, anxiety is a little bit related to the idea of motivation. When we talk about motivation and language learning, we often hear people talk about a distinction between intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is motivation within, the joy of learning language for learning the language, versus extrinsic motivation. I'm learning a language because of grades, or I'm learning a language because of my job. And some people sometimes think that, well, intrinsic is better than extrinsic. But the truth is, they're both good. In fact, there's some interesting studies that have been done with really high-level language learners and asking them, why did you really push yourself to become really high level? Why didn't you just satisfy yourself with an intermediate kind of proficiency? And a lot of them point to extrinsic motivation factors as to why they push themselves even higher, because there was a job or there was some other external reason why they stuck with the language to push themselves further. So both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are important, But what's even maybe more important is what type of motivation is that it's a learner is self-motivated, that when they get discouraged, they're willing to strategize, find another way to get back into the language and keep trying. Teachers can help with this by using relevant and engaging materials, making sure to mask the activities that learners are doing to their level so that they're not getting discouraged and that they feel this motivational and performance motivation. As they do well, they feel strong, and so they want to keep trying. This relates to the idea of self-regulation. Some people are better goal setters. They're better able to monitor their progress, see how quickly they are getting towards their goal, make adjustments as necessary. They're good at using strategies and evaluating their strategy use. So self-regulation is a big factor that influences how well someone is able to acquire a language. So in this video, we've talked about a variety of different factors that can influence whether an individual will be a good language learner. We've talked about age, background, anxiety, motivation, and self-regulation.